December 12, 1944, Camp McCain, Mississippi. The air was cold and still when the transport truck rumbled through the gates, its engine echoing off the pines. Inside, 43 German women sat motionless, faces pale beneath their caps, uniforms loose from months of hunger. They had been on the road for 3 days since docking in New York, a journey across a strange, victorious land. Each checkpoint, each American face had reminded them how far they had fallen. But as the truck halted before the command post, no one on the base expected what would step down from that vehicle. Colonel James Mercer stood waiting beside the truck, coat collar turned up against the chill. He had processed thousands of prisoners since North Africa. Battle-hardened men, defiant officers, even captured U-boat crews. He thought he'd seen it all. Until that gate dropped. The first to emerge was Martha Keller, 25, a former Luftwaffe radio operator. She descended slowly, gripping the side rail, her body rigid with pride but trembling with fatigue. Her cheeks were sunken, her skin almost translucent, her eyes the pale blue of someone who had lived too long on too little. Mercer's jaw tightened. These weren't soldiers, they were survivors. One by one, the others followed. Hannah Vogt, barely 20, looked more like a lost child than a uniformed POW. Margaret Brown, a field nurse, moved with the weary grace of someone who had patched wounds she could never unsee. Elsa Weber, thin as a shadow, stumbled but refused help. And then came Clara Stein, who had to be lifted down by 2 guards, her legs trembling too violently to hold her. Their boots touched American soil, but their faces carried the famine of a dying Europe. Lieutenant Alice Monroe, the camp's female officer, felt her stomach tighten. Before the war, she had been a schoolteacher in Ohio, used to young women laughing in classrooms, not collapsing in prison yards. She had expected arrogance, resistance, even hostility, but what she saw was something else entirely: hunger carved into human form. The kind of hunger that stripped away pride and left only the instinct to endure. Private Tommy Reed, a farm boy from Iowa, muttered under his breath, "They look like they haven't eaten in months." His words hung in the frosty air. The women didn't understand them, but they understood his tone. Martha Keller met the young soldier's eyes. For a fleeting second, she saw not an enemy but a human, startled, pitying, unsure. She drew herself upright, her frame trembling with effort, determined not to let them see her weakness. The silence stretched. The Americans stood frozen between duty and disbelief, while the prisoners, barely holding themselves upright, waited for the next order. Behind them, the sun slipped behind the trees, casting long, cold shadows over the camp. Another meal was being served in the mess hall, the smell of meatloaf and mashed potatoes drifting across the yard. That smell hit Martha like a blow. It was ordinary to the soldiers, the kind of meal you complained about, the kind that reminded you of home without meaning much. But to her it was a memory of a world long gone, Berlin before the bombings, her mother's kitchen, warm bread, thick gravy, laughter at the dinner table. She could almost hear the sound of a spoon scraping against a full plate. Then came the years of ration cards, the slow disappearance of butter, then meat, then even flour. Hunger hadn't arrived all at once. It crept quietly until it became everything. Now, as she stood under the American flag fluttering above Camp McCain, Martha realized how far that hunger had carried her. Across an ocean into captivity, into a land that fed even its prisoners better than her people had been fed in freedom. She didn't know yet what meatloaf was, but the smell alone was enough to make her stomach twist in longing. And when an American guard opened the mess door and the scent grew stronger, every woman in that line straightened unconsciously, drawn by the promise of something they had forgotten how to imagine: a full meal. The winter sun rose weakly over Camp McCain, painting the pine barracks in a pale gold that did little to chase the chill from the air. Inside the women's quarters, silence hung thick until the faint creak of boots broke it. Lieutenant Alice Moore appeared at the door, clipboard in hand, her expression professional but eyes soft with concern. She had spent the entire night debating procedures, reports, regulations, all of which seemed irrelevant after seeing those hollow faces. At dawn, she'd stood in Colonel Lewis's office, insisting that food must come first. He had simply nodded. "Feed them," he said. "We can process later." Martha Schaefer rose automatically when Moore entered, her posture rigid from years of military discipline. The effort made her dizzy, but she refused to show weakness. Around her, the other women stirred, their movements slow, deliberate. the instinct for self-preservation still stronger than exhaustion. None of them spoke. They didn't yet know what kind of place this was, in prison, camp, or something in between. Their march to the mess hall was short, but for women whose bodies had been running on fumes for months, it felt like a campaign. The smell hit them first. Warm bread, roasted meat, the unmistakable sweetness of cooked potatoes. It was intoxicating. Johanna Fischer's legs nearly buckled. She clutched the sleeve of Margaret Krause's uniform for balance, whispering something in German that sounded like a prayer. Inside, long tables waited, already laid out. The American cooks had been instructed to serve something simple yet hearty: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, gravy, a side of peas, and milk. To the Americans, it was a standard winter meal. To the German prisoners, it was unimaginable abundance. Martha hesitated at the table's edge. Habit told her to wait for orders. Lieutenant Moore motioned gently. "Go ahead, eat." The words seemed to break a spell. Chairs scraped, trays clattered, and for a moment all discipline dissolved. Johanna trembled as she lifted her fork, her hands shaking so badly that the peas scattered across the plate. Margaretti helped her scoop them up again, whispering softly, "Langsam, eat slowly." The first bite brought silence, then tears. Not one woman spoke. Some chewed with mechanical precision, afraid the food might disappear if they looked away. Others wept openly, the simple act of eating too overwhelming to contain. Martha's first taste of mashed potatoes nearly undid her. She had forgotten the texture of softness, the feeling of food that melted rather than resisted. Her body, confused by sudden nourishment, trembled with gratitude and disbelief. Private Tommy Reeves stood in the doorway, watching. The day before, he'd been the one to whisper, "My God, they're starving." Now he saw what starvation truly meant, the way these women devoured without greed, only desperate need. He'd grown up in Iowa, where food was simple but plenty. Watching them, he felt something shift inside him, a mix of guilt, compassion, and a strange, humbling awe. Lieutenant Moore moved quietly between tables, checking on each woman. She had seen hunger before during the Depression, but nothing like this. These women were not beggars or refugees. They were soldiers once proud, now reduced to the most basic human struggle: survival. "Eat," she whispered whenever someone paused. "You're safe now." Martha looked up at her through watery eyes. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. For the first time in years, the sound of kindness reached her. When the meal ended, the women sat back in stunned silence, the room filled with the quiet rhythm of breathing, deep, full breaths that felt unfamiliar. Some stared at their empty plates as if not quite believing what they'd just experienced. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the pine trees white. Inside, something else had thawed, the thin layer of fear that had coated every gesture, every glance. Hunger no longer owned them, at least not for today. Lieutenant Moore collected her clipboard, meeting Colonel Lewis outside. "How'd they take it?" he asked. "They ate," she replied softly, "like children who forgot what full feels like." Lewis nodded once, his jaw tight. "Then let them remember." Behind Martha, the other women slowly pushed themselves upright, their bodies stiff from exhaustion and malnutrition. The wool blankets issued the night before still clung to their shoulders, coarse and heavy, yet warmer than anything they had felt in months. For many, the feel of real warmth was so foreign that they had barely slept, afraid that closing their eyes might cause it to vanish. Lieutenant Alice Moore stood at the doorway, the pale morning light outlining her figure. "Good morning," she said in clear, slow English, her tone gentle but firm. She gestured toward the door and added a single word: "Breakfast." Then, awkwardly, she mimed the act of eating, feeling faintly ridiculous but unwilling to let language stand in the way. Martha's eyes flickered with recognition. She had studied English years ago, before the war swallowed her youth. "Essen," she whispered to the others, her voice trembling. "Food." The word rippled through the group like an electric current. Johanna pressed a hand to her hollow stomach. Clara swayed on her feet, dizzy from both weakness and disbelief. The women fell into formation almost instinctively, their training overriding their frailty. They crossed the compound in silence, boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. As they walked, their eyes darted about, studying the world of their captors. The American guards they passed looked nothing like the gaunt German soldiers they'd last seen. Their uniforms were whole, their faces full, their manner calm. The camp itself appeared almost unreal. The buildings freshly painted, the fences straight, the air thick with the scent of pine rather than decay. Then they saw it. The mess hall. A long wooden building, steam curling from the vents. Lieutenant Moore pulled the door open and a wave of scent rolled out. The smell alone stopped them cold. Hot food, real food, meat, bread, and something sweet beneath it all. Coffee that smelled like the kind brewed in their mother's kitchens. Not the scorched substitute of roasted barley they had endured for years. Else Bauer made a soft sound, half gasp, half sob. Inside, Sergeant William Tucker stood behind the serving line, his sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on the door. He had been awake since before dawn, preparing for this moment. When Colonel Lewis had described the prisoner's state, Tucker had said little, just nodded and gone to work. He had seen their faces the night before, hollow cheeks, trembling hands, women too proud to beg and too weak to stand. He was a man who believed food could do what medicine could not. Since losing his wife 3 years earlier, cooking had been the one way he still felt useful, a way to keep something human alive in the machinery of war. And so he had made a decision that would be remembered for decades. These prisoners would eat the same breakfast as American soldiers. When a young corporal had hesitated, asking, "Shouldn't we follow ration protocol, Sarge?" Tucker had simply pointed toward the barracks and said quietly, "You look at them and tell me that's enough." Now, as the first women entered, the hall fell silent. Metal trays waited neatly on the counter, cups lined in a row. But it was what sat behind the serving line that made Martha's breath hitch. Before her lay a plate that looked like a dream, a thick slice of meatloaf glistening with brown gravy, a mountain of mashed potatoes crowned with melting butter, bright green beans speckled with bits of bacon, 2 soft slices of white bread, and a small dish of cherry cobbler glowing crimson beneath its golden crust. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the tray. Tears welled up, hot and uncontrollable. For months she had refused to cry, not when bombs fell, not when comrades starved. But now, faced with a plate of food, her composure shattered. Sergeant Tucker served her himself, his movements steady but reverent like a priest at communion. "Here you go, ma'am," he said quietly. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Respect, not pity. Behind her, Johanna began to weep openly as her tray filled. Margarete steadied her, whispering something soft in German. Lieutenant Moore guided the weakest to their seats, her own throat tight. Around the room, spoons clinked faintly against metal trays as the women began to eat. Slowly at first, then faster, their restraint dissolving under hunger and disbelief. No one spoke. The only sound was eating, the quiet, rhythmic proof that life, after all it had taken, could still offer mercy. Clara sank heavily onto the bench, her eyes fixed on the tray before her as though it might vanish if she dared to blink. Margaret hovered beside her, hands trembling, uncertain where to begin, afraid that touching the food might break whatever fragile spell had brought it into being. It was Elsa who moved first. She lifted her fork with shaking hands, cut off a small piece of meatloaf and brought it to her lips. The first taste, and real meat, seasoned and tender, struck her like a physical jolt. A small sound escaped her, half sob, half moan, and then restraint dissolved. She ate with desperate urgency, manners forgotten, hunger swallowing discipline whole. The others followed within seconds. 43 starving women suddenly feasting like survivors of a famine. The American soldiers standing guard looked away, shame and awe mingling on their faces. Johanna devoured her mashed potatoes so fast she began to choke, coughing through tears. Martha tried to keep her composure, to eat with dignity, but her body betrayed her, her fork moving faster until the motion became a blur. Margaret shoveled food into her mouth with one hand, while clutching her stomach with the other, as though she could hold the meal inside by sheer willpower. Clara was the first to finish, 5 minutes, no more, then stared down at her empty tray in disbelief. Her eyes filled not with satisfaction but loss. It was as though she had consumed something sacred and feared she'd never see it again. Private Tommy Reeves stood along the mess hall wall, rifle forgotten in his hands. He had been ordered to maintain security, but this was not a scene of prisoners. It was something else entirely. Something raw, not horror, humanity. Across the room, Johanna tore her bread apart, cramming the pieces into her mouth too quickly to chew. The small paper cup of butter sat untouched until she noticed it. a yellow square glistening like gold. She stared, then lifted it directly to her mouth and bit down. The taste, real butter, rich and creamy, overwhelmed her senses. Her eyes rolled back, tears streaming again, the pleasure so sharp it bordered on pain. Corporal David Chen had grown up watching his parents scrape through the Depression in San Francisco's Chinatown. He thought he understood hunger. But this was different. These women weren't merely hungry. They were trying to relearn trust, to believe that the world might still feed them tomorrow. He moved down the serving line quietly and began preparing second helpings. Sergeant Tucker, seeing him, gave a single approving nod. He had expected this. He had made extra. He knew their bodies would reject the food at first, that it would take days for their systems to remember how to receive nourishment. But he also knew that healing had already begun, with this meal, with this mercy. Martha finished her meatloaf and reached for the green beans, abandoning her fork and eating with her fingers. Her last barrier broke when she tasted the cherry cobbler. The sweetness, the buttered crust, the burst of real fruit. She bent over her tray and wept, tears spilling into her food, salt mixing with sugar, the sound of her sobs rising above the soft clatter of utensils. Elsie scraped her tray clean with her finger, gathering every trace of gravy, every crumb, every molecule of butter. She licked her hands again and again, dimly aware of the soldiers watching but unable to stop. Dignity could wait. Food mattered more. Lieutenant Moore felt her throat tighten as she watched. She had prepared herself for defiance, for hostility, even hatred. She had not prepared for this, for women weeping over food, for the unbearable sight of need laid bare. Across the hall, Colonel Lewis met her gaze. His face mirrored hers, pity, anger, resolve. When Corporal Chen offered second helpings, several women looked up at him with eyes so full of desperate hope that he had to turn away to hide his emotion. Margaret reached out with a shaking hand and accepted a scoop of mashed potatoes. Then in halting, broken English, she whispered, "Thank you, thank you." The words were thick with tears, but their sincerity struck everyone silent. 2 hours later, the mess hall was quiet. Too quiet. More than half of the German women were violently ill. Their bodies, shrunken and unprepared, rebelled against the sudden flood of nourishment. The barracks turned into an improvised infirmary. Margaret, still weak herself, drew on her training as a nurse, tending to the others between bouts of nausea. Lieutenant Moore called for the camp physician, Dr. Benjamin Walsh. When he arrived, the sight that met him left him momentarily speechless. Rows of women, pale and trembling. The aftermath of kindness too rich for their fragile bodies to endure. But beneath the misery, something fragile had begun to grow, hope. Dr. Benjamin Walsh examined the women with growing concern. Their immediate distress was obvious: stomach cramps, nausea, dizziness. But the deeper damage was harder to measure. In his report that evening, he wrote quietly, "Severely underweight. Evidence of prolonged starvation. Vitamin deficiencies apparent. Must proceed with extreme caution to avoid refeeding complications." Even as their bodies rebelled, the women couldn't stop thinking about food. Johanna lay on her cot, clutching her cramping stomach, whispering to Elsa beside her, "It was worth it. Even this pain. It was worth it." Else nodded weakly. They had been sick from hunger so many times that being sick from fullness almost felt like a strange, beautiful victory. Sergeant Tucker met with Dr. Walsh that night. Smaller portions, the doctor advised. More frequent meals, softer foods, gradual buildup. Tucker nodded but hesitated. The logic was sound, but the heart rebelled. Every instinct told him to feed them more, to give them everything at once. By evening, most of the women had recovered enough to sit together in the barracks common room. The air smelled faintly of soap and warm bread from the kitchens nearby. Martha sat against the wall, her small diary open on her knees, writing for the first time since her capture. Her pen scratched across the page in careful German. "How can I describe this? How do I explain that our enemies have fed us better in one morning than our own army did in months? What does this say about everything we believed?" Clara spoke softly from the next bunk. "My brother wrote to me last year from the Eastern Front," she said in German. "He told me the Russian prisoners they captured were starving. He said it was because the Soviets didn't care for their own men." She paused, voice breaking. "But we were starving too. Our own army left us hungry. The Americans have had us for one day. And they feed us like this. What does that make us? The silence that followed was heavier than words. Johanna, the youngest, spoke next, her voice trembling. They told us the Americans were weak, that their abundance made them soft, but they share that abundance, even with us, even with their enemies. Her voice cracked into laughter, brittle and tired. We were so wrong. Margaret thought of her daughter Sophie in Hamburg. Was she still alive? Was anyone feeding her with this kind of kindness? For the first time, she wondered if all her sacrifices, the hunger, the loyalty, the obedience had meant anything at all. 3 days after their arrival, Martha approached Lieutenant Alice Moore with halting English. We work? Kitchen, please. Alice understood. This wasn't just about food, it was about dignity. Colonel Lewis approved the request under one condition. Sergeant Tucker would supervise every shift. The next morning, 6 women reported for kitchen duty. Tucker greeted them with cautious warmth, demonstrating through gestures and slow words, peeling potatoes, washing dishes, stirring pots. Alice proved gifted almost immediately. She studied Tucker's every motion, learning silently. When he noticed, he smiled faintly and showed her how to season vegetables, how to test the oven, how to know when meat was ready. She mirrored his gestures exactly, proud of her precision. Corporal Chen worked beside Clara at the dish station. She was meticulous, almost reverent, washing each plate as though the dishes themselves deserved gratitude. When Chen showed her a faster method, she smiled, shyly but real. The first smile he'd seen from her. The kitchen became their bridge, a place where words mattered less than purpose. Johanna learned to knead bread under Tucker's steady hand. Her frail arms gained strength with each motion. The rhythm became her therapy, press, fold, turn, a slow rebuilding of body and soul. The smell of rising dough meant safety now. By the second week, the 6 women began trading words, German for English. Kartoffel, Clara would say, holding up a potato. Potato, Chen replied, both laughing at each other's pronunciation. For the first time, laughter returned to Camp McCain. Sergeant Tucker noticed something subtle. The women in the kitchen were healing faster, not just physically, but in spirit. Their eyes no longer looked hollow. They met his gaze now, tentative but unafraid. Something had shifted. Not quite hope, but the outline of it. In January 1945, the International Red Cross authorized mail between POWs and families. Lieutenant Moore handed out paper and pencils, explaining through Martha's translation that they could write home. The reaction was immediate. Joy, anxiety, disbelief. What could they even say? Martha stared at the blank page for hours before writing carefully. I am safe and well treated. The Americans follow the Geneva Convention strictly. I am healthy and working in the camp kitchen. Please write to me about how you are managing. I think of you constantly. She didn't mention the meatloaf, the butter, the cherry cobbler. Some mercies felt too painful to describe. Johanna wrote to her mother in Munich with youthful enthusiasm, describing bread making, kindness, even laughter. When she finished, she worried it sounded wrong, too happy, too light for a prisoner. She nearly tore it up, then stopped. Her mother deserved the truth. She was alive and safe. Margaret's letter to her daughter Sophie was tear-stained before she reached the second line. My darling girl, I hope this finds you safe. I have enough to eat. I think of you every moment. Be brave. I will come home as soon as I can. Your Mutti loves you more than all the stars. The letters left the camp in mid-January. Weeks passed. Then February came. Gray skies, mud, silence. No replies. Martha began to fear the worst. Berlin was still being bombed. Perhaps her parents were gone. Then one morning, a single envelope arrived, addressed to Clara. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The paper rustled softly. When she finished reading, she didn't speak. But her face told the story. Her mother was dead. Her father missing. Her sister, alone in the ruins of Stuttgart. And yet, through her tears, Clara whispered something no one expected. At least, someone wrote back. The war in Europe had ended 7 months earlier. Japan had surrendered in August. The world was finally at peace. But peace didn't know what to do with them. The 43 German women held at Camp McCain existed in a strange in-between, not quite prisoners, not yet free. They were no longer enemies, but not citizens either. Just forgotten pieces of a war that had ended without them. Sergeant Tucker had been planning the Christmas meal for weeks. He wanted to give them one final memory, something good to hold on to when they returned home. Something that might remind them that even in war, kindness had survived. That morning, the mess hall glowed with warmth and color. Paper chains hung from the ceiling, cut and strung together by both Americans and Germans. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with bits of ribbon and buttons. Beneath it, brown paper-wrapped gifts, small things bought by soldiers with their own money. When the German women entered, they froze in the doorway. It wasn't a prison hall anymore. It looked like a home. Martha felt her throat tighten. None of this was required. None of it was policy. This was compassion. Lieutenant Alice Moore touched her shoulder softly. "Merry Christmas, Martha." Martha looked up, her English now clear and confident. "Merry Christmas, Lieutenant," she whispered, her voice trembling. The feast that followed was beyond anything they'd known. Roasted turkey with sage dressing, honey-glazed ham, fresh rolls with real butter, pies, and cranberry sauce that shimmered like rubies in the light. But this time they didn't devour it in fear. They ate slowly, with gratitude. They had learned at last that food would come again tomorrow. After the meal, Colonel Lewis stood to speak. Martha rose to translate, as she always did. "Ladies," the colonel began, "you came to us as enemies. Soon you'll return to rebuild your homes and your country. I hope when you do, you remember that Americans believe in second chances, in forgiveness, in friendship." When he finished, silence filled the hall. Then Elsa, thin, quiet Elsa, who rarely spoke at all, rose from her seat. Her voice was shaky but strong. "Sir," she said in practiced English, "some of us, we do not want to go back." The room went utterly still. "Germany is broken. Here we found something we never had before. We found hope." Her words hit everyone like a wave, and soldiers, officers, prisoners, no one moved. That night, 18 of the 43 women signed a petition. They wanted to stay in the United States. They wrote their reasons carefully, each one in her own hand. They had lost families, homes, everything that tied them to Germany. What waited back there wasn't home anymore, only ruins. But here, in captivity, they had discovered humanity, kindness, a version of life they never knew could exist. Martha, chosen to represent them, stood before Colonel Lewis the next morning. She held the petition in trembling hands. "Sir," she said softly, "we served a lie. We believed in something that destroyed us. But here we learned truth, in the way you treated us, in the food you shared, in the mercy you showed. Please, let us build new lives from that truth." The colonel didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a prisoner but a woman reborn through compassion. "I don't know if Washington will allow it," he said finally. "But I promise you this, I'll fight for it." Outside, snow began to fall over the camp. For the first time in years, the women didn't see it as cold or cruel. It was quiet, clean, almost peaceful. Martha lifted her face to the sky, the flakes melting against her skin. She thought of her parents, of Sophie, of everything she had lost. And for the first time since the war began, she whispered a prayer not of fear but of gratitude. Because even in captivity, she had found freedom. Her English was now fluent, her understanding of American culture surprisingly deep after a year of daily interaction. "Colonel," Martha began, standing tall in the office that once terrified her, "we understand this is unusual. We know we were your enemies, but we have learned what America truly means. Not from propaganda, not from newspapers, but from how you treated us when you had every reason to hate us. You fed us when we were starving. You gave us dignity when we expected cruelty. You gave us hope when we had lost everything." Colonel Lewis said nothing for a moment. He simply nodded, his expression solemn. He had led soldiers in battle, but this was a different kind of courage. The military response took months. Lawyers debated legal precedents. Politicians argued about optics. Would allowing former enemy soldiers to remain send the wrong message? Or would it prove that America's strength was its compassion? The debate reached Washington, where people who had never seen Camp McCain made decisions based on policy, not the faces of the women waiting behind its fences. While bureaucracy moved at its usual slow, grinding pace, life at the camp continued. The German women were no longer treated as prisoners. They worked alongside American cooks, cleaned barracks, attended English classes run by Lieutenant Moore, and even studied American civics. Sergeant Tucker's kitchen became a classroom where cultures blended, German spices meeting Southern recipes, creating something entirely new. Corporal Chen organized exchange nights, evenings where both sides shared songs, stories, laughter. For a few hours there was no war, no sides, just people trying to remember how to be human again. Then in March of 1946, a letter arrived for Margaret. It was from Hamburg. Her daughter Sophie was alive, living with neighbors after Margaret's mother had died in a bombing raid. The news shattered and healed her in the same heartbeat. Sophie needed her. So with tears in her eyes, Margaret made the hardest choice, to return home. Of the 18 who had petitioned to stay, 12 were eventually granted permission. They became displaced persons waiting years for full immigration status. But they stayed. They worked. They built new lives on foreign soil that somehow began to feel like home. Martha was sponsored by a family in Georgia who needed a translator. Else went to Ohio to work in a hospital kitchen, helping feed the sick with the same care Sergeant Tucker had once shown her. Johanna, the youngest, was taken in by Lieutenant Moore's family. She would later attend college and become a teacher, teaching not only language but empathy. 25 years later, in a quiet kitchen in Atlanta, Martha stirred gravy over a steaming pan of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, Sergeant Tucker's recipe. Her American husband set the table. Their 3 children laughed in the living room, and as she spooned the gravy over the meat, she paused. For a moment, she was back in that camp, standing in line, trembling, holding a metal tray while tears fell down her face at the sight of real food. She smiled softly, because that meal had changed everything. It had turned an enemy into a believer, not in a flag but in humanity itself. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window. Martha whispered, "Danke, Sergeant Tucker." And somewhere, maybe, the echo of his kindness lived on. In every meal shared without judgment, in every act of compassion that bridged a divide.